My name is Adela Smith, and I am 28 years old. 1 year ago, my sister looked my 7-year-old son in the eye on Christmas Eve and told him that Santa Claus does not visit poor people's houses. She said it while handing her own children brand new tablets right in front of my parents, who simply watched my boy cry. They thought my bank account made me an easy target. They thought my silence meant I was broken. Then, 12 months later, I pulled into their pristine Mountain Brook driveway in a custom matte black Range Rover, paid for in cash. The neighbors stopped walking their dogs and stared. My mother dropped a holiday gift bag right out of her hands onto the front porch. And the sister who mocked my children suddenly realized the polite southern bubble she lived in was about to burst. Before I tell you exactly how I audited their fake wealth and dismantled their perfect facade, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Luke Revenge Start. But only do it if you know what it feels like to be the family scapegoat. Drop a comment and tell me your age and where you are watching from. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to that December night. My parents live in Mountain Brook, Alabama. It is the kind of neighborhood where the lawns look manicured even in the dead of winter, and the driveways are filled with imported luxury sedans. Inside my mother's living room, the air smelled like expensive pine and roasted pecans. A 12-foot tree stood in the corner, dripping with glass ornaments. I sat on the edge of a stiff velvet sofa with my son Leo and my 5-year-old daughter Mia. We were the charity guests. I knew it, and they knew it. My sister Chloe and her husband Brad sat across from us. Brad works in boutique finance and wears his golf tan like a badge of honor. Chloe treats her life like a magazine spread. They were holding court, handing out presents to their 2 kids. The wrapping paper flew everywhere. Designer sneakers, high-end gaming consoles, cashmere sweaters. Leo and Mia sat with their hands folded in their laps. They wore their Sunday best, which meant outgrown slacks and a dress I bought on clearance at a discount store. They watched their cousins tear through piles of wealth. They did not ask for anything. My kids know better. But then Leo saw a gap in the chaos. He looked up at the towering tree and then over to Chloe. He asked a simple, quiet question. "Aunt Chloe, did Santa leave anything under there for us?" The room went still. The sound of ripping paper stopped. Chloe smiled. It was that specific type of southern smile that looks sweet, but cuts straight to the bone. She tilted her head and looked at my 7-year-old. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with fake pity. "Santa does not really visit poor people's houses. Your mom has to buy your gifts." She did not yell. She did not sneer. She delivered it like a helpful fact. I looked at my mother, Brenda. She was sitting in her armchair holding a glass of red wine. She took a slow sip. She did not correct Chloe. She did not comfort Leo. She just watched the scene unfold with mild interest. My father was in the kitchen, pouring another drink, choosing to be deaf to the entire exchange. Brad chuckled under his breath and went back to assembling a drone for his son. Leo looked down at his shoes. His lower lip trembled. Mia grabbed my hand and squeezed it. There was no screaming match. I did not flip the coffee table. I stood up, gathered our coats, and said it was time to go. The walk to my car felt like miles. It was a 12-year-old sedan with a heater that barely worked and a rattling exhaust. I strapped the kids into their car seats and pulled out of that immaculate neighborhood, heading toward our cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the cheaper side of Birmingham. The drive took 30 minutes. For the first 20, nobody spoke. Then, from the back seat, I heard a soft, rhythmic intake of breath. Leo was crying. He was trying to do it quietly so I would not hear him. Mia was rubbing his shoulder, whispering that it was okay. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. I looked at their reflections in the rearview mirror, and I knew something had to change. We made it back to our apartment. I carried Mia inside. She had fallen asleep on the short drive, her cheek pressed against the cold window. Leo walked quietly beside me, holding my hand. His face was blotchy, but he had stopped crying. He was trying to be brave. That hurt worse than the tears. Our apartment was small. The walls were thin, and the heater clanked every time it kicked on. I tucked them both into their beds. I pulled up the mismatched blankets and kissed their foreheads. On the floor next to Leo's bed sat his gifts from me. A puzzle missing a corner piece I found at a thrift store, and a plastic action figure still in the dollar store packaging. He had not even looked at them since we got home. I closed their bedroom door and walked into the kitchen. I sat down at the table. It was a scarred, wooden thing with one wobbly leg. I opened my banking app on my phone. The screen glared in the dark room. $142. That was it. That was the sum total of my safety net. Rent was due in a week. Groceries were running low. This was the reality my family loved to hold over my head. They never missed an opportunity to remind me how I ended up here. 4 years ago, my husband walked out. He packed his bags while I was at work, left a brief note on the counter, and vanished to Florida with a woman he met at a gym. He drained our joint savings account before he went. I was 24, with a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and zero financial foundation. When I went to my parents for help, they did not offer a safety net. They offered a lecture. My mother, Brenda, sat me down and explained that men need to feel appreciated. She implied that if I had been more attentive, more focused on keeping a good home, he would not have strayed. My father agreed. He said the Smith family did not believe in divorce, and that I had failed to hold my marriage together. They treated my abandonment not as a tragedy, but as a personal failure. A moral failing that I now had to pay for. And then there was Chloe. Chloe married Brad right out of college. Brad landed a job at a boutique finance firm in Mountain Brook. They bought the big house, joined the right country club, and drove the right cars. They were the standard. They were the golden standard of success that Brenda and my father worshipped. I was the cautionary tale, the black sheep who could not keep a man and could not pay her bills. For years I accepted that role. I believed I deserved it. I shrank myself to fit their narrative. I wore the hand-me-downs. I accepted the pitying looks. I swallowed the passive-aggressive comments at every holiday dinner. I thought if I just stayed quiet, if I just stayed humble, eventually they would see I was trying. Eventually they would love me. But sitting at that wobbly kitchen table, staring at $142, something broke. Or maybe something finally healed. The tears stopped. The tight, anxious knot in my chest that had been there for 4 years vanished. It was replaced by a strange, cold clarity. I realized I had been playing a rigged game. I was trying to earn respect from people who needed me to fail so they could feel successful. Chloe did not tell Leo that Santa ignores poor people because she was thoughtless. She said it because she enjoyed the power of it. She enjoyed reminding me in front of everyone that she was superior. My mother did not stay silent because she was shocked. She stayed silent because she agreed. They did not want me to succeed. They needed a scapegoat. They needed a baseline of failure to make their own achievements look taller, and as long as I kept shrinking to make them comfortable, my children would continue to pay the price. Leo and Mia would grow up believing they were less than. They would internalize the exact same shame my family had spent years pouring onto me. I would not let that happen. I could not protect them by playing the victim anymore. I needed money. I needed leverage. I needed the one thing my family respected: power. I worked as an administrative assistant at a local logistics firm. I made $14 an hour. I organized spreadsheets, filed invoices, and managed schedules. But I was good at it. Really good at it. I understood data. I understood how systems worked. Before I got married, I had started a degree in business administration. I dropped out when I got pregnant with Leo. I stood up from the table. I walked to the counter and poured a glass of tap water. I drank it in one long swallow. The cold settled in my stomach. I went to my bedroom and dug my old laptop out from under the bed. It was a cheap, heavy brick of a machine. The battery only lasted 20 minutes, so it had to stay plugged in. I carried it to the kitchen table, plugged the cord into the wall, and booted it up. The fan whined loudly in the quiet apartment. I opened a search engine. I did not search for administrative jobs. I did not search for hourly wages. I typed in high-ticket freelance corporate consulting. The results flooded the screen. Articles about digital strategy, posts about optimizing e-commerce operations, case studies on data-driven market expansion. I read for hours. I read until the text blurred and my eyes burned. Companies were paying thousands of dollars for people to look at their messy internal data and build systems to fix it. They were paying for efficiency. They were paying for the exact skills I used every single day to keep a logistics firm running for $14 an hour. The only difference was the title and the confidence to ask for the money. I did not have a degree. I did not have a slick corporate resume. I did not have connections in Mountain Brook. What I had was desperation and a wobbly kitchen table. And I had a vow. I swore to myself, looking at the cracked screen of that laptop, that by next Christmas, my children would never feel small again. I would build a fortress around them. A fortress made of undeniable, irrefutable success. I created a new email address. I drafted a basic profile on 3 different high-end freelance platforms. I positioned myself not as an assistant, but as an operations strategist. I spent the rest of the night until the sun started to turn the sky gray outside my window, researching how to pitch corporate clients. I would keep my day job. I had to. The rent was still due. The groceries still needed to be bought. But the hours between when my kids went to sleep and when the sun came up, those hours belonged to the grind. I shut the laptop at 6 in the morning. I showered, dressed, and woke Leo and Mia for school. I made them oatmeal. I smiled and told them we were going to have a great day. I drove them to their school, dropped them off, and headed to the logistics firm. I sat at my desk, logged into my $14 an hour job, and waited for 5 o'clock. The silent grind had begun. My family thought I was broke. They thought I was beaten. They had no idea I was quietly studying the blueprints of their own game, preparing to dismantle it, brick by brick. To the rest of the city, I was invisible. From 8 in the morning until 5 in the evening, I sat at a metal desk under flickering fluorescent lights, answering phones and processing freight invoices. I was polite. I was quiet. I blended into the beige walls of the logistics firm. My coworkers thought I was just another tired single mother trying to scrape by until payday. They had no idea that when the clock struck 9 at night, I became someone else. The physical toll of building a business in the shadows is a specific kind of torture. My shift did not end when I put my children to sleep. It started. I would wash my face, make a pot of cheap dark roast coffee, and sit down at the wobbly kitchen table. From 9 until 3 in the morning, I was the founder and lead strategist of a boutique digital agency. I survived on 4 hours of sleep. My alarm went off at 7 every single morning, and dragging myself out of bed felt like wading through wet cement. My eyes constantly burned. My hands would shake by the time I poured my second cup of coffee at the office. But I learned to push the exhaustion down into a dark corner of my mind and lock the door. The math of my life left zero room for error. I brought home roughly $2,000 a month after taxes. Rent for our cramped apartment was $900. Daycare for Mia and after-school care for Leo cost $800. Utilities, gas, and groceries devoured the rest. Every single penny I could scrape from the bottom of the barrel went into the business. I skipped lunches to pay the state filing fees to incorporate my LLC. I sold my only good winter coat to a consignment shop to pay for web hosting and a professional domain name. I built my agency website using a free template, learning basic coding through online tutorials at 2 in the morning while my children slept in the next room. I targeted mid-level e-commerce brands, companies that were growing fast but had broken internal systems. Because of my day job, I knew exactly where supply chains leaked money. I knew how poorly most businesses handled their digital fulfillment strategies. I drafted pitch decks that targeted those exact blind spots. I sent dozens of cold emails a week into the void. Most went unanswered. Some replied with polite rejections. I printed every rejection email and taped it to the wall above my kitchen table. I did not look at them as failures. I looked at them as practice. By the time April arrived, the exhaustion was a physical weight sitting on my chest. I was running on fumes, holding my life together with caffeine and sheer willpower. And then came Easter. In my family, Easter is a mandatory performance. My mother Brenda hosted it every year at her house in Mountain Brook. Attendance was not requested, it was required. I dressed Leo and Mia in the best clothes I could find at the local thrift store. I ironed their shirts 3 times. I put on a plain navy dress and applied an extra layer of cheap concealer to hide the dark circles under my eyes. The moment we walked through Brenda's front door, the air felt thick. The house smelled of roasted lamb and expensive floral arrangements. Aunts, uncles, and cousins milled around the pristine living room, holding crystal glasses filled with mimosas. Brad and Chloe were holding court near the fireplace. Brad wore a tailored pastel linen suit, swirling a glass of bourbon. Chloe wore a designer floral dress, her hair blown out in perfect, expensive waves. We sat down for dinner at a long mahogany table. The conversation shifted to the economy. My father complained about tax rates and the cost of doing business. Brad leaned back in his chair, his eyes sliding down the table to where I sat, quietly cutting Mia's food. "It is a lack of work ethic," Brad said, his voice projecting just loud enough for the whole table to hear. "People want handouts. They want the government to subsidize their bad choices. Nobody wants to actually put in the sweat equity anymore. They just expect successful people to carry the burden." He took a sip of his bourbon and smiled at me. "Is that right, Adela?" The table went quiet. The clinking of silverware stopped. My mother dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin and looked away. I looked at Brad. I looked at his expensive suit and his perfect tan. I felt the burn of humiliation hot and sharp in my chest. But I did not shrink. I did not look down. I held his gaze and kept my voice perfectly level. "I think sweat equity pays off eventually, Brad. You just have to know what you are building." He scoffed, rolling his eyes, and steered the conversation back to his golf handicap. An hour later, the true performance began. The family was gathering their coats in the foyer, preparing to leave. Chloe walked down the grand staircase dragging a heavy-duty black plastic trash bag behind her. It thumped against the hardwood floor. She stopped right in front of me. The extended family paused, watching the scene. Chloe smiled her signature Southern pageant smile. "Adela, I was cleaning out the kids' closets this morning. I know how hard things have been for you lately. I packed up some things my kids have outgrown. It should save you a trip to the discount store." She nudged the black trash bag toward my feet with her designer heel. It was a calculated public spectacle. She wanted an audience for her charity. I looked down at the bag. The top was untied. I could see the collar of a shirt stained with old juice and a pair of jeans with the knees worn completely through. It was actual garbage. My aunt murmured something about how sweet Chloe was to think of us. Every instinct in my body screamed to kick the bag back at her, to tell her exactly what I thought of her condescension. But I looked at my children standing beside me, watching my reaction. I remembered my vow. I needed leverage, not a screaming match. I picked up the heavy bag. It smelled like expensive detergent and dust. "Thank you, Chloe," I said, my voice smooth and hollow. "That is very generous of you." She beamed, soaking up the approval of the room. We walked out to my rattling sedan, loaded the trash bag into the trunk, and drove away. I did not cry on the way home. The cold clarity from Christmas Eve returned sharper than ever. I put the kids to bed and hauled the trash bag straight to the dumpster outside our apartment complex. I did not even open it. I walked back inside, sat down at the wobbly kitchen table, and opened my laptop. It was 10 at night. My hands were shaking, but not from exhaustion. I was running on pure, refined anger. I opened a draft proposal for a Texas-based retail company that was struggling to transition from brick and mortar to direct-to-consumer shipping. I had been researching them for 2 weeks. I rewrote the entire pitch in 1 hour. I used sharp, ruthless data. I showed them exactly how much money they were bleeding in inefficient logistics and offered a step-by-step digital strategy to fix it. I hit send at 2 a.m. 3 days later, my phone buzzed while I was sitting at my metal desk at the logistics firm. It was an email from the CEO of the Texas company. They did not want to schedule a follow-up call. They did not want to negotiate. The email contained a signed contract and a request for an invoice. They accepted my pitch. A $5,000 monthly retainer. I stared at the screen. The numbers blurred. $5,000. In one single moment, my income more than doubled. The blueprint worked. The phantom agency I built in the dark was real. I walked to the office bathroom, locked the door, and pressed my hands against the cool porcelain sink. I looked at my reflection. The dark circles were still there. The cheap clothes were still there. But the woman looking back at me was no longer a victim. She was a strategist. I had my first piece of leverage. I had proof of concept. The fortress was finally under construction. But hiding a growing empire requires energy I was rapidly running out of. The late nights and the constant stress were beginning to leave physical marks. I was dropping weight. I was constantly distracted. I thought I was keeping my two worlds perfectly separated. I was wrong. My mother had noticed the changes, and in her mind, a single mother looking exhausted and secretive could only mean one thing. I was about to find out exactly how little faith my own family had in me, and how far they would go to keep me in my place. The physical toll of living 2 different lives was catching up to me faster than I could manage. It was a Thursday afternoon in late April. I had called out sick from the logistics firm, burning one of my 3 annual personal days. I did not have a fever or a cough. I had a deadline. My new client in Texas needed their digital supply chain audit by Friday morning, and I needed the second half of my $5,000 retainer. I sat at the wobbly kitchen table in sweatpants and an oversized t-shirt. My hair was tied up in a messy knot. The apartment around me was a casualty of my ambition. A towering pile of unfolded laundry occupied the entire sofa. The sink was overflowing with cereal bowls and plastic cups. Scattered crayons and puzzle pieces littered the faded carpet. I had stopped performing the duties of a perfect homemaker because every ounce of my energy was poured into building my fortress. My fingers flew across the keyboard. The glow of the screen illuminated the dark circles under my eyes. I was running on a lethal combination of cheap dark roast coffee and pure adrenaline. Then the sound of a key turning in the front door shattered the silence. I froze. I only gave a spare key to one person for emergencies involving the children. The heavy wooden door swung open. My mother, Brenda, stood in the entryway. She wore a crisp white tennis skirt and a pale pink cashmere sweater draped over her shoulders. Diamond studs gleamed in her ears. She carried a leather designer handbag resting on her forearm like a shield. Her expensive floral perfume immediately flooded the small living room, suffocating the smell of stale coffee and damp towels. I snapped my laptop shut in one swift motion. I slid it under a stack of unpaid utility bills on the table. It was a pure survival instinct. I knew how my family operated. If they saw something they did not understand, they mocked it. If they saw something valuable, they found a way to take credit for it or tear it down. My business was my leverage. It was the only secret I possessed, and I would not let her taint it. Brenda did not greet me. She stood on the thin welcome mat and slowly swept her gaze across the room. I watched her catalog every single flaw. Her eyes lingered on the overflowing sink. They darted to the mountain of laundry. They stopped on my unwashed hair and the dark hollows under my eyes. She stepped further inside, refusing to close the door behind her as if the air in my home was too toxic to breathe trapped in a confined space. "You look unwell, Adela," she said. Her voice was smooth, but it carried a sharp edge. I stood up, wiping my hands on my sweatpants. "I am just tired, Mom. The kids had a long week. What are you doing here?" She walked past me, running a manicured finger along the edge of the kitchen counter. She inspected her fingertip for dust. "Chloe told me you looked like a ghost at Easter. She was worried about you. We all are." Chloe was never worried about anyone but herself. I kept my face neutral. "I am fine, just fighting off a cold." Brenda turned to face me. She looked at the stack of bills on the table where my laptop was hidden. She noticed the black power cord snaking down the table leg plugging into the wall. Her eyes narrowed. "You took the day off work," she stated. It was not a question. "You are losing hours at that little desk job of yours, and yet you are sitting here in the middle of the day looking like you have not slept in a week." "I am handling things," I replied, keeping my tone flat. "Are you?" Brenda countered. "Because it does not look like you are handling anything. It looks like you are spiraling." She took a step closer. The floral perfume grew stronger. "I know money is tight, Adela. Brad and Chloe know it too. We see you struggling. But there are decent ways to ask for help." I crossed my arms. "I have not asked anyone for help." "Exactly," she snapped. "You are drowning in debt, and yet you refuse to come to your family. Instead, you lock yourself in this filthy apartment. You stay up all hours of the night. Do not think I have not noticed the timestamps on the rare text messages you send me. 3 in the morning. 4 in the morning. A cold knot formed in my stomach. She was observing me closer than I realized. "What are you doing on that computer, Adela?" she asked, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "What kind of work pays a woman to hide in the dark?" I stared at her. The implication hung in the air, heavy and vile. She did not see a strategist. She did not see an entrepreneur. She looked at her daughter, a desperate single mother, and assumed the lowest possible denominator. She thought I was doing something illegal. She thought I was doing something shameful online for cash. "I am doing administrative freelance work," I lied, keeping my voice steady. "Data entry. It pays the electric bill." She sighed, a long, dramatic sound of disappointment. "Data entry. Right. Listen to me. I am hosting the Country Club Auxiliary Board this Saturday for a spring garden party. The catering staff is short-handed. I need you at my house at 6 in the morning. You will help scrub the patio, organize the silverware, and manage the kitchen staff. I will pay you $200. She was offering me wages to be her maid in front of her wealthy friends. It was a power play designed to remind me of my place. A year ago, I would have said yes. I would have put on a modest dress and served appetizers to women who looked right through me. But I was no longer the woman who shrank to fit their mold. I had a client in Texas paying me $5,000 a month. I had dignity. "No, thank you," I said. Brenda blinked. Her perfect posture faltered for a fraction of a second. "Excuse me, I cannot do it, Mom. I am busy this weekend." "Busy doing what?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Wallowing in this pigsty, staring at a screen, doing whatever shameful things you are doing to scrape by." "I am offering you an olive branch, Adela. I am offering you honest work." "I do not want your olive branch, and I do not need your $200. I held my ground, refusing to lower my gaze. "Please leave. I have things to finish before the kids get home from school." The temperature in the room plummeted. Brenda pulled her shoulders back. The polite Southern mother vanished. The predator stepped forward. "You are making a very dangerous mistake," she whispered. "You think you can disrespect me? You think you can reject your family while you live in squalor?" She gestured to the room around us. "Look at this place. Look at the state of you. Do you think this is a suitable environment for Leo and Mia?" My heart hammered against my ribs. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I am a concerned grandmother," Brenda replied, her tone turning to ice. "I am saying that if the state were to see the conditions these children are living in, if a social worker were to look at an exhausted mother with no visible means of support, hiding mysterious online activities, they might decide this is an unsafe home." The air left my lungs. She was threatening to take my children. My own mother was standing in my kitchen, using my flesh and blood as a weapon to force my submission. She would rather rip my family apart and traumatize her grandchildren than tolerate my independence. "It takes one phone call, Adela," she continued, turning toward the door. "Just one phone call from a concerned citizen. Think very carefully about your schedule this weekend. I expect you at my house at 6 o'clock sharp on Saturday morning." She walked out and pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind her. The lock clicked into place. I stood frozen in the center of the kitchen. The silence rushed back in, ringing in my ears. For 28 years, I had tried to find the hidden reservoir in my mother. I had made excuses for her coldness. I had rationalized the favoritism she showed Chloe. I had convinced myself that beneath the harsh criticism lay a deep, protective maternal bond. That illusion died right there on the faded carpet. There was no love. There was only a desperate need for control. They did not just want me to be the scapegoat. They needed me to be a hostage. And the moment a hostage stops playing their part, the captor resorts to violence. The threat of Child Protective Services was not an empty bluff. Brenda had the resources, the pristine reputation, and the social connections in Mountain Brook to make my life a living hell. She could tie me up in legal battles for years. She could weaponize my poverty against me in a court of law. A profound, chilling liberation washed over me. When your mother threatens to take your children, she ceases to be your mother. She becomes an obstacle. She becomes the enemy. And you do not negotiate with an enemy. You outmaneuver them. I walked over to the kitchen table. I pulled my laptop out from under the stack of bills and opened the lid. The screen glowed to life. I did not cry. I did not panic. I opened my banking app. The second half of the retainer had cleared. My balance was no longer $142. I had capital. I had leverage. I could not stay in this apartment. It was too accessible. They knew where I lived. They had a key. They had the power to show up unannounced and terrorize me. I needed to vanish. I needed to build a moat around my children so wide and so deep that Brenda and Chloe could never cross it. I closed the Texas audit file. I opened a real estate website. I filtered the search results for premium school districts, gated access, and immediate availability. The silent grind was over. The silent escape was about to begin. The threat hanging over my head acted like a heavy dose of adrenaline injected straight into my veins. Brenda had shown me the absolute bottom of the barrel regarding her maternal instincts. I did not have the luxury of gradual growth anymore. I needed to move fast, and I needed to vanish. I spent the next month operating in a state of hyper-focused urgency. I slept 3 hours a night. I drank so much cheap coffee my stomach constantly burned. I pored over LinkedIn profiles, searching for mid-sized companies with messy digital footprints. I targeted an artisanal coffee distributor in Georgia struggling with supply chain bottlenecks and a boutique athletic wear brand in Tennessee that was bleeding money on inefficient targeted ads. I sent tailored audit proposals to their executive teams. I did not beg for their business. I pointed out exactly how much cash they were leaving on the table and offered to plug the holes. By the second week of May, both contracts were signed. My monthly income leaped from $5,000 to $14,000. The numbers in my banking app looked foreign, like they belonged to a different person. But I did not have time to celebrate. The logistics of my escape required cold, precise calculation. I spent my lunch breaks at the logistics firm scouring rental listings. I needed security. I needed a gate. I needed a premium school district where my children would blend in with success rather than standing out as the charity cases. I found it in Hoover. It was a beautiful 3-bedroom townhome in a gated community, complete with a security guard at the front entrance. The neighborhood boasted top-tier elementary schools and manicured parks. The rent was steep, but my new income easily covered it. I took a 2-hour lunch break, met the leasing agent, and signed the paperwork. I paid the first and last month's rent, plus a security deposit via wire transfer. The agent handed me 2 heavy brass keys. I held them tight, feeling the sharp edges dig into my palm. It was the first tangible piece of my fortress. The move had to be invisible. If my family caught wind of my new address, they would twist the narrative. They would show up demanding access, claiming they had a right to my space. I would not give them the opportunity to infect my new life. I rented a small box truck under a fake name on a Friday evening. I waited until Leo and Mia were asleep. Working entirely alone, I packed our entire lives into cardboard boxes. We did not own much. The hand-me-down furniture stayed behind in the cramped Birmingham apartment. I only took our clothes, their toys, my laptop, and a few sentimental items. At 2 a.m, I carried my sleeping children down the stairs and strapped them into the cab of the moving truck. I locked the door to the old apartment and slid the key under the mat. I drove south toward Hoover, watching the city lights blur in the rearview mirror. We arrived at the townhome just as the sky began to turn a bruised purple. I carried Leo and Mia inside, laying them on an air mattress in their new spacious bedroom. I stood by the window, watching the security guard patrol the front gate. For the first time in 4 years, my shoulders dropped. The tight, anxious knot that had lived in my chest finally unspooled. We were safe. The next week was a blur of unpacking, enrolling the kids in their new school, and submitting my official resignation at the logistics firm. Walking out of that office building, leaving behind the $14 an hour wage, felt like shedding an old skin. I was officially a full-time CEO. I did not change my phone number. I wanted to see how long it would take for my family to realize I was gone. It took exactly 9 days. My phone buzzed on a Saturday afternoon. I was sitting on my new plush sofa watching Leo and Mia play in the fenced backyard. It was Brenda. I let it ring 3 times before hitting accept. I put it on speakerphone and set it on the coffee table. "Hello?" I said, my voice calm. Adela, Brenda barked, skipping any form of greeting. "Where are you? I drove by your apartment to drop off some old Tupperware and it looks empty. The leasing office said you broke your lease." Her voice was tight. The panic of losing her scapegoat was bleeding through the phone line. "I moved, Mom," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "Moved where?" she demanded. "Why did you not tell me? You cannot just pack up your children and disappear. I am hosting a barbecue for Memorial Day tomorrow, and I need you here early to help set up the patio furniture." The audacity was staggering. She threatened to call Child Protective Services on me less than 2 months ago, and now she was demanding I act as her unpaid labor for a neighborhood party. "I am not coming to the barbecue, Mom," I said. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Excuse me, I am not coming," I repeated, enunciating every syllable. "I am spending the holiday with my children. We have plans." "Plans?" Brenda scoffed, her voice dripping with venom. "What plans do you have, Adela? You do not have the money to take those kids anywhere. You are being ridiculous. Give me your new address right now. Brad is going to drive over there and help you move whatever junk you took with you." She was trying to reassert dominance. She was searching for the invisible leash she had held for 28 years. "No," I said. Silence stretched across the connection. A thick, heavy silence. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice dropping dangerously low. "I said no. You do not get my address. You do not get to command my time. You threatened to take my children away from me because you did not like that I was exhausted. You are not a safe person for me or for them. You do not have access to my life anymore. Adela Smith, you listen to me." Brenda started, her voice rising into a shrill shriek. I reached out and pressed the red button on the screen. The call disconnected. I sat there on the sofa, listening to the sounds of my children laughing in the backyard. My hands were not shaking. My heart was not racing. I had drawn the first line in the sand. The boundary was set. If you are watching this right now, and you have ever had to look a toxic family member in the eye and close the door on them, drop a heart in the comments. I know how heavy that door feels. But I also know the peace that waits on the other side. Brenda called back 6 times. I silenced my phone and went outside to push Mia on the swing. I knew the retaliation would come. I knew my family would twist this narrative, spinning a story for their country club friends about the ungrateful, unstable daughter who ran away. I did not care. They could have the narrative. I had the reality. But I needed to grow faster. I needed more capital. A secure townhome was a good start, but it was not the fortress I promised my children. I needed to build something undeniable. The boutique agency was thriving, but to reach the level of wealth that would truly insulate me from Brad and Chloe, I needed a whale. I needed a corporate client that would catapult my firm into the stratosphere. I spent the next 3 weeks hunting. I scoured industry journals and financial reports. I was looking for a massive corporation with a glaring digital blind spot. And then I found her. Sylvia Sterling, the 60-year-old CEO of a massive retail syndicate based in Huntsville. She was notoriously ruthless, brilliant, and terrifyingly demanding. Her company was bleeding millions in inefficient targeted advertising and broken supply chain logistics. I knew exactly how to fix it. But getting a meeting with a titan like Sylvia Sterling when you are running a boutique agency out of your living room required more than a polite email. It required a calculated, bold maneuver. The quiet escape was successful. Now it was time to kick down the front door of the corporate world. 6 months had passed since I packed my sleeping children into a rented truck and disappeared into the night. My boutique agency was turning a healthy profit, but I was hungry for the whale. I needed the kind of capital that built generational fortresses. I set my sights on Huntsville, Alabama. Sylvia Sterling was a titan. She was 60 years old with silver hair cut into a sharp geometric bob and a reputation that made grown men sweat in boardrooms. She ran a retail syndicate that controlled dozens of mid-level brands across the Southeast. Her company was generating huge revenue, but my outside research showed their profit margins were shrinking. They were wasting cash on outdated digital advertising and broken shipping routes. I knew I could fix it. I did not send a polite inquiry to her human resources department. I found out Sylvia was hosting an open networking breakfast for female entrepreneurs at a high-end hotel in downtown Huntsville. I drove 2 hours north, paid the steep entry fee, and waited near the espresso station. When she walked by, looking visibly bored by the sycophants surrounding her, I stepped directly into her path. I handed her a single sheet of premium cardstock. It did not have my resume. It featured a graph showing exactly where her flagship brand lost $3 million in the last quarter due to cart abandonment rates and inefficient warehousing fees. Sylvia stopped walking. She read the paper and then looked up at me. She told me I had exactly 10 minutes in her office at noon. I walked into her corporate headquarters 3 hours later. Glass walls, mahogany desks, and panoramic views of the entire city. Her office was the size of my old apartment. She sat behind her desk, looking at a tablet. She did not offer me a seat. She asked me to explain who I was and what firm I represented. I told her my name and that I ran my own independent strategy agency. She tapped the screen of her tablet, pulling up my background. Her eyes narrowed. You do not have a master's degree, Adela. You do not have a corporate pedigree. My background check says you were an administrative clerk 6 months ago. Why on earth would I hand you the keys to my digital infrastructure when I have elite agencies in New York begging for this contract? She slid the cardstock back across the desk. I appreciate your hustle, she said, her tone dismissing me. But my syndicate requires proven leadership. Have a safe drive back to Birmingham. My heart pounded against my ribs. I thought about the wobbly kitchen table. I thought about Chloe handing me a garbage bag of stained clothes. I thought about my mother threatening to take Leo and Mia. I refused to walk out of that room. I placed my hands flat on her mahogany desk and leaned forward. I dropped the polite, polished corporate persona I had practiced all week. I do not have a fancy degree, Sylvia, I said, holding her gaze. But those elite agencies in New York do not care about your margins. They care about their billing hours. Your current logistics partner is charging you a premium for overnight shipping on items that sit in regional distribution centers for 3 days. Your marketing department is spending $200,000 a month on social media campaigns targeting demographics that have not shopped at your stores since the 90s. I took a slow breath, letting the silence hang for a fraction of a second before delivering the final blow. You are bleeding capital through 1,000 tiny cuts because your executives are too comfortable to look at the raw data. I looked at it. I can stop the bleeding in 30 days. If I fail, you fire me and you lose nothing. If I succeed, you stop lighting millions of dollars on fire. The room went dead silent. Sylvia stared at me. The bored expression vanished. She leaned back in her leather chair, steepled her fingers, and let out a sharp bark of laughter. It was a genuine, terrifying sound. She gestured to the leather chair opposite her desk. She told me to sit down. We spent the next 2 hours tearing through her internal reports. I showed her every single flaw, holding nothing back. I did not sugarcoat the incompetence of her current vendors. I laid out a comprehensive digital overhaul that would slash her operational costs by 30%. At 2 in the afternoon, Sylvia pushed a thick document across the desk. It was a vendor agreement for a 1-year consultancy. The numbers printed on the bottom line made my breath catch. It was a multi-million-dollar annual contract. My firm would receive an initial wire transfer that dwarfed everything I had earned in my entire life combined. "You start Monday," Sylvia said. "Do not make me regret this." Over the next few months, Sylvia became much more than a client. She became the mentor I had always craved. We spent hours in her office reviewing portfolios and market trends. I watched how she dismantled opponents in negotiations without ever raising her voice. She taught me the difference between the illusion of success and actual power. One evening, we were having dinner at a quiet steakhouse in Huntsville. The waiter poured sparkling water into our crystal glasses. I told Sylvia briefly about my family in Mountain Brook. I mentioned the country club memberships, the leased luxury cars, and the constant need to display their status to everyone around them. I explained how they used their money as a weapon to make me feel small. Sylvia took a sip of her water and smiled a very cold, knowing smile. "Fake wealth is loud, Adela," she told me. "Fake wealth screams for attention because it is terrified of being exposed. Real wealth whispers. It does not need a golf course membership to prove it exists. Real wealth is the ability to buy the golf course and fire the board of directors. You must build leverage. You must control the assets. Everything else is just expensive theater." I absorbed every word. I applied her ruthless logic to my own business, scaling my operations and hiring a small team of remote analysts to handle the heavy lifting. The fortress around my children grew stronger every single day. I paid off all my lingering debts. I set up secure investment accounts. I was finally untouchable. Or so I thought. Autumn arrived, painting the Alabama trees in beautiful shades of copper and gold. I was sitting in my sunlit home office, sipping coffee and reviewing quarterly projections. My phone rang. It was Sylvia. Her voice was brisk and strictly business. She told me her syndicate was considering a lucrative investment opportunity. A boutique finance firm had approached her board begging for a $10 million cash injection to expand their operations. Sylvia did not trust their internal reporting. She suspected they were hiding liabilities. She wanted her sharpest strategist to perform a blind audit of their books before she committed a single dime to the project. I opened my email while she was still on the line. I downloaded the encrypted file containing the target company's financial disclosures. I unzipped the folder and clicked on the executive summary. I stared at the name printed in bold letters at the top of the page. The breath rushed out of my lungs. The finance firm, begging for a survival lifeline, belonged to Brad. My smug, condescending brother-in-law was secretly asking my mentor for money. My sitting environment was peaceful, secure, and entirely paid for. I sat in my ergonomic chair, staring at the high-definition monitor on my desk. The sunlight filtered through the plantation shutters of my Hoover townhome, casting long, warm shadows across the hardwood floor. The document open on my screen, however, was a portrait of sheer panic. The header read, Mountain Brook Capital Partners. Brad was listed as the managing director and majority shareholder. I blinked, waiting for the letters to rearrange themselves into a different word. They did not. The boutique finance firm begging my mentor for a $10 million lifeline belonged to the man who had sat at Easter dinner and lectured me about sweat equity. The man who chuckled when his wife told my 7-year-old son that Santa ignores poor people. I took a slow breath. I reached for my coffee mug and took a sip. The liquid was lukewarm, but it grounded me. I leaned forward and began to scroll through the executive summary. Sylvia Sterling had a brilliant instinct for detecting corporate rot. She sensed something was wrong with this proposal, and her instincts were flawless. Brad presented a beautiful pitch deck filled with sleek graphics, projected growth charts, and confident market analysis. To an untrained eye, it looked like a thriving firm ready to scale to the next level. But I was not an untrained eye. I was the strategist Sylvia trusted to find the cracks in the foundation. I opened the raw financial data files, the spreadsheets Brad hoped the syndicate would gloss over. The deeper I dug, the worse it became. Brad was running a classic shell game. His firm was bleeding cash at an astonishing rate. To cover the operational losses, he had taken out high-interest mezzanine loans. When those came due, he opened new lines of credit, leveraging the remaining performing assets he had left. He was borrowing from tomorrow to pay for yesterday. Then I opened his personal disclosures required for a capital injection of this size. The reality of my sister's life laid bare in columns of red ink. The pristine 5-bedroom house in Mountain Brook with the manicured lawn. It carried a primary mortgage and 2 separate home equity lines of credit, both pushed to their absolute limits. The luxury cars they drove to the country club every weekend, leased. And they were 3 months behind on the payments. The designer clothes Chloe wore when she handed me a trash bag of stained hand-me-downs, purchased on a revolving credit account with an interest rate approaching 25%. They owned nothing. Their entire existence was a carefully constructed mirage, funded by debt and sustained by sheer arrogance. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence of my home office wash over me. The irony was so potent, it almost felt physical. For years, Brad sat at the head of a mahogany dining table and declared that people wanted handouts. He claimed successful men like him were forced to carry the burden. Yet here he was. Brad was on his knees, begging a corporate syndicate for a $10 million handout just to keep the lights on. I thought about Chloe. I thought about the sweet, venomous smile she wore when she crushed Leo's spirit on Christmas Eve. She had to know their finances were crumbling. She had to feel the terror of those mounting credit card bills. Her cruelty was not just arrogance. It was a projection. She needed to look down on me because looking in the mirror terrified her. Handing me that trash bag of clothes was a desperate attempt to remind herself that she was still on top, even as the ground collapsed beneath her designer heels. A lesser person might have picked up the phone. I could have called my mother right then. I could have forwarded the spreadsheets to her inbox and watched the golden child shatter into a million pieces. I could have driven to Mountain Brook, knocked on their heavy oak front door, and laughed in their faces. But I remembered what Sylvia taught me. Fake wealth is loud. Real power is silent. I did not intervene out of malice. I did not sabotage the numbers or invent liabilities. I simply did the job Sylvia hired me to do. I opened a blank document and began to type. I stripped the emotion from my words. I became a surgeon operating on a balance sheet. I detailed the exact ratio of Brad's debt to his shrinking revenue. I highlighted the shadow accounts where he attempted to hide failing investments. I mapped out the timeline of his impending insolvency, proving mathematically that his firm would cross the point of no return within 6 months. I concluded the report with a single objective paragraph. I stated that Mountain Brook Capital Partners represented a toxic asset with zero potential for return on investment. I advised the syndicate to deny the funding request entirely and sever all communications to avoid exposure to their inevitable bankruptcy. I read the report twice, checking every calculation. It was flawless. It was a death warrant written in standard business font. I attached the file to an email addressed to Sylvia. I hit send. I closed my laptop and stood up. I walked into the kitchen to prepare dinner for Leo and Mia. I chopped vegetables and boiled pasta, listening to the sound of them doing homework at the kitchen island. This island was made of solid quartz, not scarred wood with a wobbly leg. My children were safe. Their future was secure. I felt a profound calm settle over my life. I had delivered the truth to the one person who controlled Brad's fate. I knew what would happen next. Sylvia would read my audit. She would trust my analysis. She would kill the $10 million deal with a single phone call, offering no explanation and leaving no room for negotiation. Brad would be left staring at a dead phone line, his final lifeline severed. He would have no idea who audited his books. He would have no idea that the sister-in-law he discarded had just sealed his financial coffin. Months passed. Summer faded into a crisp Alabama autumn. My agency continued to scale. I hired 3 more remote analysts to handle my growing client roster. I upgraded my vehicle, trading in the rattling sedan for a custom matte black Range Rover autobiography, paying the dealer entirely in cash. I walked into the showroom, pointed at the exact model I wanted, and drove it off the lot 2 hours later. It was a quiet indulgence, a reward for the sleepless nights and the relentless grind. I did not hear a single word from my family. The silence was glorious. I assumed Brenda was still furious about my refusal to serve as her party maid. I assumed Chloe and Brad were too busy rearranging deck chairs on their sinking financial ship to notice my absence. But the calendar is relentless. November turned into December. The holiday season arrived, bringing with it the smell of pine and the inevitable collision of past and present. It had been exactly 1 year since that agonizing drive back to my old apartment. 1 year since Chloe told my son that Santa ignores poor people. I was sitting in my office, reviewing year-end tax strategies when my phone illuminated with an incoming call. The caller ID displayed a name I had not seen on my screen in over 6 months. Brenda. I watched the phone vibrate across the polished wood of my desk. I knew what this meant. The holiday season demands a performance, and my mother was missing her favorite supporting actress. She needed her scapegoat back to make her golden child look shiny again. I let it ring 3 times. Then I reached out and answered. The final act was about to begin. The phone buzzed against the mahogany of my desk. I stared at the name on the screen. Brenda. I had not spoken to my mother since that spring afternoon when she threatened to rip my children away. I picked up the phone. I did not say hello. I simply answered and waited. Adela, Brenda said, her voice coated in a sugary sweetness that set my teeth on edge. It has been a long time. I hope you and the children are well. I am fine, Mom, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. What do you want? She sighed, a long, dramatic sound designed to convey maternal disappointment. Do not be like that, Adela. It is the holidays. Families should be together. I am calling to invite you to our annual Christmas Eve party. I know we had our differences earlier this year, but it is time to put all that silliness behind us. Silliness. She threatened to call Child Protective Services because my apartment was messy and my eyes were tired. She reduced the most terrifying moment of my life to a trivial misunderstanding. I am busy, I said. Oh, please, Adela, she scoffed, the sugary coating slipping for a fraction of a second. You are not busy. And honestly, you need to come. Chloe feels terrible about the distance between us. In fact, she went out of her way to buy some extra charity gifts for Leo and Mia. She knows things are tight for you right now, and she wants the kids to have something nice to unwrap. My grip tightened on the phone. The sheer arrogance of it. Chloe was drowning in toxic debt. Her husband was leading their family straight into bankruptcy. And yet, she still needed the performance. She still needed to present herself as the benevolent, wealthy sister, handing out scraps to the struggling single mother. I looked up from my desk. Through the glass doors of my home office, I could see Leo and Mia in the living room. They were building a massive fort out of sofa cushions and blankets. They were laughing. They were safe. They were not the charity cases Brenda and Chloe desperately needed them to be. A year ago, that invitation would have crushed me. A year ago, I would have hung up the phone and cried in my wobbly kitchen chair, paralyzed by the shame they projected onto me. But I was no longer that woman. I was the strategist who killed Brad's $10 million lifeline with a single keystroke. I controlled the narrative now. "I will be there," I said, my voice smooth and calm. "What time should we arrive?" Brenda sounded surprised. 7 o'clock, she replied quickly, recovering her haughty tone. "And please, Adela, try to dress appropriately. The neighbors will be there." I hung up the phone. I did not feel anger. I felt anticipation. The kind of anticipation a predator feels when the prey willingly steps into the trap. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing for the party with the same surgical precision I applied to my corporate audits. This was not going to be a petty screaming match. I was not going to walk into my mother's house and demand apologies. Apologies are for people who still care about the relationship. I was going to dismantle their illusion of superiority so thoroughly that they would never look at me the same way again. First, I needed the right armor. When you have been poor your entire life, your concept of dressing well is usually loud. It is flashy logos and bright colors designed to prove you belong. But Sylvia had taught me better. Real wealth does not scream. It whispers. I booked a private appointment at a high-end boutique in downtown Birmingham. I purchased a tailored charcoal cashmere coat over a simple, elegant black silk dress. I bought genuine diamond stud earrings, not the cubic zirconia I used to wear to family events. Next, I addressed the transportation. My custom matte black Range Rover autobiography was scheduled for delivery the week before Christmas. I called the dealership and confirmed the arrival date. They assured me the vehicle was ready, detailed, and waiting. Finally, I focused on the most important element of the evening, the gifts. Chloe wanted to hand my children generic charity toys. She wanted to stand in front of the extended family and the Mountain Brook neighbors and perform her role as the savior. I was going to let her play her part right up until the moment I dropped the curtain. I did not go to a department store. I called a specialized luxury concierge service. I ordered 2 custom-built motorized miniature cars, a silver Mercedes G-Wagon for Leo, and a red Porsche convertible for Mia. They featured working headlights, leather seats, and Bluetooth stereos. I arranged for a discreet delivery service to transport the vehicles to my mother's house and wait out of sight until I gave the signal. But tangible toys were only the beginning. I needed to annihilate the narrative that I was financially dependent. I contacted my wealth manager. I established 2 fully funded college trust portfolios, one for each of my children. I deposited $50,000 into each account as the initial principal. I requested formal embossed certificates confirming the trusts. Then I booked a first-class family vacation to Zermatt, Switzerland, departing on December 26th. I printed the luxury itinerary, including the 5-star chalet accommodations and private ski lessons. I placed the trust certificates and the travel documents into 2 thick cream-colored envelopes, sealing them with gold wax. I packed the envelopes into my designer handbag. On the afternoon of December 24th, I stood in the foyer of my townhome. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. The charcoal coat fit perfectly. The silk dress draped flawlessly. My hair was styled in a sleek, professional blowout. I did not look like the exhausted administrative assistant from the logistics firm. I looked like a CEO. Leo and Mia came running down the stairs. They looked impeccable. Leo wore a tailored navy blazer and dark jeans. Mia wore a beautiful emerald green velvet dress with a white faux fur coat. They were glowing with excitement. "Are we going to Grandma's house?" Leo asked, his eyes bright. "Yes, we are," I said, adjusting the collar of his blazer. And it is going to be a very special Christmas Eve. We walked out to the garage. The overhead door rolled up, revealing the matte black Range Rover. The paint absorbed the light, looking sleek and aggressive. I strapped the kids into the plush leather seats, starting the powerful engine with a push of a button. I backed out of the driveway and headed toward Mountain Brook. The drive took 30 minutes, the same 30 minutes I had driven a year ago, gripped by humiliation and despair. This time, the cabin of the car was warm and silent. The heated steering wheel felt solid under my hands. I listened to the soft classical music playing through the premium sound system. I thought about Brad. I wondered how much pressure he was under tonight. His firm was suffocating. Sylvia had pulled the $10 million deal 3 months ago. He was likely scrambling to keep his creditors at bay while maintaining the charade for his wife and his mother-in-law. I knew he would be looking for an angle tonight. He would be desperate to assert his dominance, to remind himself that he was still the king of the Smith family. I was going to let him try. We crossed the city limits into Mountain Brook. The streets grew wider, lined with massive oak trees wrapped in twinkling white lights. The houses swelled in size, sprawling brick estates with manicured lawns and circular driveways. I turned onto my mother's street. It was lined with expensive leased vehicles. A silver BMW, a white Lexus SUV, a slate gray Mercedes sedan. The uniform of the desperate trying to look established. I approached my mother's house. The 12-foot tree was visible through the large front window exactly where it had stood a year ago. I saw figures moving inside, holding drinks, laughing, performing for the audience of neighbors and extended family. I did not park on the street. I turned the steering wheel and pulled the massive matte black Range Rover directly into the center of the pristine driveway, blocking 2 of the leased sedans. I put the vehicle in park and killed the engine. The reckoning had arrived. The engine of the matte black Range Rover autobiography idled with a low, powerful hum. I shifted the vehicle into park right in the middle of my mother's circular driveway. It was an aggressive position, blocking the pristine path to the front door and trapping the least luxury sedans my family prized so highly. The statement was deliberate. I was not slipping into their world through the side entrance anymore. Through the tinted windows, I watched the neighborhood react. The couple from across the street, who always judged my old rattling sedan, stopped their evening stroll. The man holding a golden retriever on a leash stared openly at the custom matte finish of my SUV. The vehicle did not look like it belonged to a suburban mother struggling to make ends meet. It looked like it belonged to a cartel boss or a tech billionaire. I took a slow, steadying breath. The leather of the steering wheel felt warm beneath my hands. The moment of reckoning had arrived. I turned off the ignition and stepped out into the crisp December air. The heavy door closed behind me with a solid, satisfying thud. The sound echoed across the manicured lawns. I walked around to the passenger side, opening the doors for Leo and Mia. They scrambled out, glowing with excitement. Leo adjusted his navy blazer, his small hands pulling at the lapels, trying to look sharp. Mia twirled in her emerald velvet dress, the white faux fur coat catching the light from the outdoor lanterns. They did not look like charity cases. They looked like heirs. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal cashmere coat. I stood tall, feeling the weight of the genuine diamond studs in my ears. The transformation was complete. The exhausted administrative assistant who cried over a bank balance of $142 was dead. The woman standing in the driveway was a strategist who moved millions of dollars with a single audit report. I took Leo's hand in my left and Mia's hand in my right. We began the walk up the long brick path toward the front porch. My mother Brenda was standing at the top of the stairs holding a large decorative gift bag. She wore a festive red cocktail dress and a perfectly styled blowout. She was waiting to perform her role as the benevolent matriarch greeting the wayward, struggling daughter. I watched her eyes track my movement. Her gaze locked on to the massive, matte black SUV sitting in her driveway. She squinted, trying to make sense of the visual information. She looked at the vehicle, then looked at me. Her eyes scanned my designer coat, the flawless tailoring of my dress, the unmistakable gleam of the diamonds. She looked at my children, dressed better than Chloe's kids had ever been. The cognitive dissonance was visible on her face. The narrative she had spent years carefully constructing, the narrative of my perpetual failure, was shattering right in front of her. Brenda's mouth opened slightly. Her fingers went slack. The large, decorative gift bag slipped from her grasp, tumbling down 2 concrete steps before spilling its contents onto the brick path. Tissue paper fluttered in the cold breeze. She did not move to pick it up. She stood frozen, staring at me as if I were a ghost. I kept walking, maintaining a steady, unhurried pace. I did not break eye contact. As we reached the base of the stairs, I glanced toward the large bay window of the living room. The heavy curtains were pulled back, revealing the warm glow of the Christmas tree inside. Standing right at the glass were Chloe and Brad. Brad held a crystal glass of bourbon halfway to his mouth. He was staring at the Range Rover, his jaw visibly clenched. He knew cars. He knew exactly what that vehicle cost, and he knew you could not fake your way into a custom autobiography edition. His face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. The arrogant sneer he wore at Easter dinner was entirely gone, replaced by raw, unfiltered shock. Chloe stood next to him, holding a plate of appetizers. Her eyes were wide, her perfect pageant smile completely wiped away. She looked from the car to my children and then directly at me. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The sister she had mocked and pitied, the sister she had handed a garbage bag of stained clothes, was standing in her mother's driveway looking untouchable. I returned my attention to Brenda. I stepped over the spilled gift bag and climbed the stairs, stopping on the top step. We were face to face. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. The air felt charged with static electricity. "Merry Christmas, Mom," I said, my voice smooth and chillingly polite. The tone was identical to the one she used when she threatened to call Child Protective Services. Brenda blinked rapidly, struggling to find her voice. "Adela," she stammered, her eyes darting back to the SUV. "Whose car is that?" "It is mine," I replied simply. Her brow furrowed in confusion and rising panic. "Yours? Did you lease that? Adela, you cannot afford a lease like that. What are you doing?" "I did not lease it, Mom," I said, stepping past her toward the front door. "I paid cash." I did not wait for her reaction. I opened the heavy oak door and guided Leo and Mia into the foyer. The entryway smelled of expensive cinnamon candles and roasted beef. The sounds of Christmas music and polite chatter drifted from the living room. I helped the kids out of their coats, hanging my cashmere jacket in the hall closet. I smoothed my silk dress and took a deep breath. The exterior perimeter had been breached. Now it was time to clear the room. I walked into the living room holding my head high. The extended family was gathered around the fireplace. Aunts, uncles, and cousins held drinks and engaged in superficial conversations. When I crossed the threshold, the chatter died instantly. The silence rippled outward, starting from Chloe and Brad near the window, and spreading until the entire room was completely quiet. Every eye turned toward me. They expected to see the hunched, defeated single mother they loved to pity. They expected to see the scapegoat ready to absorb their condescension. Instead, they saw power. My Aunt Margaret, the family gossip, clutched her pearls, staring openly at my diamond earrings. My cousin David, who always made snide comments about my old sedan, looked at my tailored dress and quickly looked away, visibly intimidated. The power dynamic shifted with the force of an earthquake. The room recognized instantly that the hierarchy had been shattered. I was no longer the bottom rung of the Smith family ladder. I was operating on an entirely different level. Brad finally moved, pulling his eyes away from the driveway. He set his bourbon glass down on a side table, the crystal clicking sharply against the wood. He forced a smile, but his eyes were hard and desperate. He needed to reassert control. He needed to prove he was still the king of this room. He took a step toward me, adjusting his expensive linen jacket. He was preparing to strike, aiming for the only vulnerability he thought I had left. He was going to attack my credibility. He was going to try and humiliate me in front of the entire family, demanding to know where the money came from, implying I had done something shameful to acquire it. I welcomed the attack. I stood my ground, holding my designer handbag tight against my side, feeling the weight of the thick envelopes inside. Brad was walking straight into the trap, and he had no idea that the jaws were already snapping shut. The air in the living room felt thick enough to cut with a blade. The scent of roasted pine needles and expensive catering hung heavy over the space, but nobody was eating. Everyone was frozen in place. The extended family members stood around the roaring fireplace, holding their crystal glasses, looking like statues in a museum exhibit. They had spent the last hour mentally preparing to mock the struggling single mother. They had sharpened their passive-aggressive comments and practiced their looks of pity. Instead, they were confronted with a woman standing in a tailored designer coat, wearing genuine diamonds and exuding an aura of undeniable authority. The cognitive short circuit was happening in real time across 20 different faces. Brad stepped away from the bay window. He moved toward the center of the room, placing himself directly in my path. The ice clinked sharply against the sides of his bourbon glass. He wore a custom-tailored pastel linen suit that cost thousands of dollars, but his shoulders were rigid. The fabric pulled tight across his back. He was carrying an immense amount of physical tension. I knew exactly why Brad operated this way. He was a man who survived entirely on perception. His entire career in boutique finance relied on convincing wealthy clients that he was wealthier and smarter than they were. When confronted with an anomaly like a custom vehicle parked in his mother-in-law's driveway, his brain could only process it through the lens of fraud. Because fraud and deception were the languages he spoke every single day to hide his own failing firm. "Well, look who finally decided to join the real world," Brad announced, his voice booming over the soft holiday music playing from the ceiling speakers. He turned his head slightly, making sure he had the attention of the aunts and uncles. "I see the rental companies are doing holiday specials this year, Adela." A few of the older male relatives chuckled nervously. It was a trained reflex. They were conditioned to laugh at his jokes because he was supposed to be the successful alpha of the family. I did not smile. I did not frown. I maintained direct, unwavering eye contact. "I do not rent, Brad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his drink, trying to project a relaxed demeanor that his rigid posture betrayed. "Right," he sneered. "So you leased it. The monthly payments on an autobiography edition run higher than most people's mortgages. Who did you have to scam to get approved for a lease like that? Or did you finally find a sugar daddy to co-sign the paperwork for you?" My mother gasped softly from the entryway behind me, but she did not intervene. She wanted to see me put in my place. She wanted her son-in-law to restore the natural hierarchy of her household. I shifted my weight, standing perfectly balanced in my designer heels. I did not raise my voice. The most powerful person in any room never has to shout. "I did not lease the vehicle, Brad. I purchased it. I wired the funds directly to the dealership on Tuesday morning. Paid in cash, clean title." The nervous chuckles from the uncles stopped instantly. The room grew noticeably quieter. The crackle of the fireplace suddenly sounded very loud. Brad scoffed a harsh, dismissive sound meant to convey disbelief. Cash, he repeated, shaking his head. You paid cash for a luxury truck. With what money, Adela, did the logistics firm hand out a generous holiday bonus to the administrative desk this year? Did they give you a promotion for answering the phones quickly? He was digging his own grave and handing me the shovel. He needed me to be small so he could feel tall. He was desperate to diminish me in front of the audience to protect his own fragile ego. I resigned from the logistics firm 7 months ago, I replied, my tone clinical and detached. I run a digital strategy agency now. I specialize in operational restructuring and market expansion for enterprise-level brands. Brad rolled his eyes, leaning back on his heels. A digital agency. What does that mean exactly? You build websites for local bakeries from your cramped apartment? You run social media pages for mechanics? He was trying to shrink my reality to fit his prejudice. But I was holding the winning hand, and it was time to lay my cards on the mahogany coffee table. My firm handles national scaling logistics, I said. We do not work with local bakeries. We identify supply chain leaks and restructure digital fulfillment for mid to large cap corporations. My current roster includes the Vanguard Athletic Group out of Nashville and Horizon Industries right here in Birmingham. I watched the color drain from his face in a slow descending wave. I knew those specific names would hit him like a physical blow. When I audited his firm for Sylvia Sterling, I saw his internal prospect lists. I saw the desperate pitches his firm had sent out trying to secure lucrative wealth management contracts to save his sinking ship. Vanguard Athletic and Horizon Industries were at the very top of his target list. Both of those companies had formally rejected his proposals last quarter, citing deep concerns about his firm's long-term stability and leverage ratios. Brad's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The smug, arrogant finance director was suddenly a man drowning in a tailored suit. He knew exactly how much capital those two corporations possessed. He knew what they paid their top-tier corporate consultants. He did the math in his head, and the resulting number terrified him. You work for Vanguard, he whispered, the booming confidence entirely gone from his voice. His knuckles turned white around his crystal glass. I do not work for them, Brad, I corrected him smoothly. They work with my agency. I am their lead external strategist. I handle their national digital integration. The silence in the living room was profound. It was not the polite quiet of a family gathering listening to a toast. It was the stunned, breathless silence of an audience watching a magic trick they could not comprehend. Uncle Robert, who worked in corporate law and understood the weight of those company names, stared at me with his mouth slightly open. He looked at my designer coat and then at Brad, realizing the power dynamic had just inverted. Cousin David looked down at his shoes, visibly embarrassed by his earlier smirks. My mother Brenda stood frozen in the entryway, her hands empty, her perfect party ruined by the presence of a daughter she could no longer control or categorize. I looked at Brad. I saw the raw terror hiding behind his eyes. He knew I was swimming in the same corporate circles he was desperately trying to survive in. He wondered what else I knew. He wondered if I had heard the industry whispers about his failing firm and his toxic debt. He had no idea I was the one who wrote the audit that killed his final chance at survival. Not yet. Chloe felt the power slipping away. Her primary currency was superficial social dominance, and she was watching her husband get dissected in front of the very people she needed to impress. The narrative of the poor, struggling sister was dead on the hardwood floor, and she had nothing to replace it with. She looked at my children standing beside me. Leo and Mia were watching the exchange with calm, steady eyes. They were not cowering. They were standing tall, their tailored clothes fitting perfectly. Chloe could not handle the shift. She needed to reassert herself. She needed to prove she was still the benevolent queen of the Smith family, dispensing grace to the less fortunate. She pivoted away from her paralyzed husband and forced a bright, manic smile onto her face. She looked past me, targeting the only perceived vulnerability I brought into the room. "Well enough, boring business talk," Chloe announced, her voice high-pitched and strained, echoing unnaturally in the quiet room. "It is Christmas Eve. We are here for the kids." She marched over to the towering Christmas tree, her designer heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. She reached under the lowest branches and pulled out 2 awkwardly wrapped boxes. "Leo! Mia, come here!" she called out, waving her hand with frantic energy. "Aunt Chloe has some very special gifts for you." The trap was set. The final confrontation was about to begin. Chloe watched her husband shrink. The man she relied on to project their superiority was standing speechless, holding a crystal glass of bourbon he forgot how to drink. The social hierarchy of the room had inverted. The relatives who usually fawned over her designer dress were now staring at my charcoal cashmere coat. Chloe could not process the shift. Her entire identity hinged on being the undisputed golden child. She needed to reclaim the floor. She looked at me and then down at my children. Leo and Mia stood quietly taking in the decorated living room. Chloe saw an opening. She remembered the script she had written for this evening. The benevolent, wealthy sister granting scraps to the destitute nephews and nieces. When she realized the adults were no longer captivated by her or Brad, she weaponized the holiday itself. Giving gifts to my children was her favorite method of enforcing the hierarchy. In her mind, handing them cheap toys was a public reminder of my failure to provide. She thrived on the pity the relatives directed toward me. "Well, enough boring business talk," Chloe announced. Her voice was high-pitched and strained, echoing unnaturally against the vaulted ceiling. "It is Christmas Eve. We are here for the kids." She marched over to the towering pine tree, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floorboards. She reached under the lowest branches and pulled out 2 awkwardly wrapped boxes. The paper was generic discount store material, tearing slightly at the corners. "Leo! Mia! Come here!" she called out, waving her hand with frantic energy. "Aunt Chloe has some very special gifts for you. I know things have been tight at home, so Uncle Brad and I wanted to make sure Santa did not forget you this year." It was a calculated performance. She projected her voice, ensuring every aunt and uncle heard her charitable declaration. Leo stepped forward hesitantly. He took the box from her outstretched hands. Mia followed, clutching her brother's sleeve. "Go ahead, open them," Chloe urged, kneeling to their eye level and flashing her pageant smile. She spoke as if she had scoured the earth to find these items, rather than grabbing them from a discount bin on her way home from the country club. Leo tore the paper away. Inside was a generic plastic action figure lacking articulation. Mia unwrapped a thin coloring book and a small box of crayons. There was no thought put into these items. They were physical manifestations of an afterthought obligations purchased at the last minute to facilitate a public display of pity. My children handled the moment with profound grace. They had lived with less for years, and they knew the value of gratitude even when the offering was hollow. "What do we say, Leo?" I asked, my tone gentle but firm. "Thank you, Aunt Chloe," Leo said, his voice polite and steady. Mia echoed him softly. I stepped forward, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. I looked directly at my sister. "Thank you, Chloe," I said, projecting my voice just as clearly as she had. "We appreciate the thought, but Santa actually stopped by our house early this morning. He asked me to arrange a special delivery for tonight." I checked the sleek silver watch on my left wrist. The timing was flawless. Right on cue, the heavy brass knocker on the front door sounded. 3 sharp strikes echoing through the quiet foyer. My mother, Brenda, jumped, startled by the unexpected noise. "Are we expecting someone else?" she asked, looking toward the hallway. I turned and walked toward the entryway. "I will get it, Mom," I said. I opened the heavy oak door. 2 uniformed delivery attendants stood on the front porch. Behind them, parked carefully at the base of the brick stairs, was a customized enclosed transport trailer. The lead attendant tipped his hat, holding a digital clipboard. "Smith delivery," he confirmed. "Bring them right into the center of the living room, please," I instructed, stepping aside. The extended family watched in stunned silence as the 2 men wheeled in the cargo. They rolled the items over the threshold, navigating the foyer and parking them side by side on the plush Persian rug directly in front of the roaring fireplace. Chloe backed away, her eyes wide. Sitting on the rug were 2 custom-built motorized miniature luxury vehicles. The first was a silver Mercedes G-Wagon featuring working LED headlights, leather-stitched seats, and custom chrome rims. The second was a cherry red Porsche convertible with a functioning Bluetooth stereo and personalized license plates reading Leo and MIA. They were flawless scale replicas. They gleamed in the firelight. My children froze. Leo dropped the plastic action figure onto the floor. It clattered against the hard wood, forgotten instantly. Mia let out a sharp squeal of pure joy, running toward the red Porsche and running her small hands over the smooth paint. "Are these ours?" Mom Leo asked, his voice breathless with awe. "They are all yours," I smiled, crouching down beside them. "Santa thought you both deserved an upgrade this year." The living room erupted into a cacophony of hushed whispers. The aunts and uncles leaned forward, trying to comprehend the sheer expense sitting on the rug. Those miniature vehicles cost more than what most people in that room earned in a month. Uncle Robert took a step closer, adjusting his glasses to inspect the dashboard of the G-Wagon. He understood the price tag associated with such items. He looked at me with newfound respect, replacing the pity he had harbored for years. The tangible magic of the holiday had just materialized in front of them, shattering the narrative that my children were deprived. For the first time in their lives, they were the center of attention for the right reasons. They were the undisputed stars of the evening. Chloe stood frozen near the Christmas tree. The cheap coloring book she had handed Mia was now lying discarded near the tree skirt. Her charity performance was annihilated. She looked at the miniature Porsche and then looked at her own children, who were staring jealously at their cousins. The iPads Chloe had given them suddenly seemed remarkably ordinary, but I was not finished. The toys were for the children to enjoy the evening. The real gifts were designed to secure their future and permanently rewrite the family hierarchy. I reached into my designer handbag. I pulled out the 2 thick cream-colored envelopes sealed with gold wax. Establishing these trusts had been the most satisfying transaction of my career. I did not just want to buy my children toys. I wanted to buy their freedom. I wanted to guarantee that they would never find themselves sitting at a wobbly kitchen table, terrified of an eviction notice. "Leo! Mia! Come back here for just one more second!" I called out over the sound of the miniature engine Leo was testing. They bounded over to me, their faces flushed with happiness. I handed one heavy envelope to each of them. "These are the most important ones," I explained, tapping the gold wax seal. "You cannot drive these or play with them right now, but I want you to hold on to them." "What is inside?" Mia asked, tilting her head. I stood up, addressing my children, but making sure my voice carried to the back of the room. "Inside those envelopes are your college trust portfolios. They are fully funded. When you graduate high school, you can go to any university you choose, and you will not owe a single dime." I paused, letting the weight of the statement settle over the room. I looked at Brenda, who was leaning against the doorway, gripping the wood trim as if she might fall over. Also, I continued turning my gaze to Leo. "In 5 days, we are flying first class to Zermatt, Switzerland. We are going to spend New Year's Eve learning how to ski in the Alps. Leo threw his arms around my waist, burying his face in my cashmere coat. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered. When I announced the fully funded college portfolios and the first-class trip to Switzerland, the room fell into a stunned silence. It was the kind of quiet that follows a lightning strike. My mother stared at the gold wax seals. Her mind struggled to reconcile the daughter she had threatened with Child Protective Services against the woman handing out six-figure financial instruments on Christmas Eve. The narrative she clung to, the story that I was a destitute failure, was dead and buried. Chloe backed away from the miniature cars, retreating until her back hit the grand piano in the corner of the room. Her hands gripped the polished edge. The generic presents she had handed out were glaring reminders of her own petty malice. She tried to humiliate us, and instead set the stage for her own eclipse. She looked at Brad, seeking reassurance, seeking someone to restore the illusion of their supremacy. Brad had nothing to offer her. He was staring at the thick cream envelopes in the hands of my children. His breathing grew shallow and rapid. The realization that I possessed the liquid capital to fund 2 trusts and pay cash for luxury vehicles tore through his fragile ego. He was a man drowning in high-interest debt, staring at a woman wielding the exact power he was desperately pretending to have. The pressure inside him reached a critical threshold. He could not accept the reality standing in his living room. He needed to find a flaw. He needed to prove I was a fraud before his own fraud was exposed to the entire family. The engine of the matte black Range Rover autobiography idled with a low, powerful hum in my memory. But inside the living room, the silence was deafening. Brad watched the gold wax seals on the trust envelopes catch the firelight. The sight acted as a final fracture in his fragile psychological architecture. For a man who built his entire identity on financial supremacy, watching a woman he deemed worthless casually deploy hundreds of thousands of dollars was intolerable. His mind scrambled to construct a defense mechanism. He could not accept that I had outsmarted him. In his worldview, a single mother without a pedigree could never generate this level of capital independently. Therefore, the money had to belong to someone else. He stepped away from the bay window and crossed the Persian rug. His tailored pastel linen jacket seemed to hang awkwardly on his frame now. He unbuttoned the front, attempting to look casual, but his hands were trembling. He stopped a few feet away from me, placing himself between my children and the Christmas tree. "Okay, let's drop the act, Adela," he said. His voice was loud, cutting through the stunned quiet of the living room. He offered a strained, forced chuckle. "It is a great show. The cars, the trips, the fake trust documents. You hired a good prop department. But we all know you do not have the liquid assets to fund any of this." My Aunt Margaret shifted uncomfortably on the sofa, clutching her crystal glass. My cousin David looked at the floor. They wanted the tension to dissipate, but Brad was dragging everyone directly into the center of his meltdown. I stood perfectly still. I did not step back. I looked at the beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "They are not props, Brad," I replied, keeping my tone low and steady. "You can verify the routing numbers on the certificates tomorrow morning." He waved his hand, dismissing my statement. "I know how the game works," he countered, his voice rising another octave. "You found a backer. You met some venture capitalist or some bored angel investor who thinks your little digital agency is a cute pet project. They handed you a line of credit and told you to go have fun. That is the only logical explanation. You are fronting someone else's capital." He was projecting. He was describing his exact business model. Brad grew up surrounded by generational wealth. He never had to build a foundation from scratch. When he launched his boutique finance firm, he relied entirely on aggressive borrowing to fund his lavish lifestyle. He leveraged other people's money to buy his country club memberships and his imported sedans. He assumed I was running the exact same grift because he lacked the imagination to understand genuine, earned success. "Who is it?" Brad demanded, taking another step closer. He lowered his voice, adopting a conspiratorial tone, trying to shift the dynamic from adversaries to peers. "Come on, Adela. You can tell me. Who is writing the checks?" "I am a managing director. I understand high-level equity partnerships. Introduce me to your backer." The desperation was palpable. It radiated off him like heat from an open oven. "My firm is expanding," Brad continued, speaking rapidly now. "We are scaling our wealth management portfolio, and we are looking for strategic investors who want guaranteed returns. If your guy has the kind of liquidity to fund first-class trips to Switzerland just for fun, he needs a serious venue for his capital. Set up a meeting. I can pitch him next week. Bring him to the club." He was begging. The man who sat at the Easter dinner table, lecturing me about sweat equity and handouts, was standing in his mother-in-law's living room, begging for a financial introduction to save his sinking ship. He thought he was throwing me a rope, offering to legitimize my success by including me in his corporate sphere. He had no idea I was holding the guillotine cord. I looked at him with profound, cold pity. I watched his chest heave under his expensive shirt. I looked past him to Chloe, who was holding her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with mounting terror. She knew her husband was exposing their vulnerability to the entire extended family. I reached into my designer handbag. The leather was smooth and cool against my fingertips. I bypassed my keys and my wallet, my fingers locating a glossy, thick folder I had placed there just hours before. I grasped the edge and pulled it out. I did not hand it to him. I held it up so the firelight illuminated the cover. The heavy cardstock bore the embossed logo of Mountain Brook Capital Partners. It was the exact prospectus Brad had submitted to the Huntsville Syndicate 3 months ago. Brad's eyes dropped to the folder. His breathing stopped. The manic, desperate energy drained out of his body in an instant. "I do not have an investor, Brad," I said. My voice was clear, carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I am the investor." He stared at the prospectus. His lips parted, but he could not form a single word. "Sylvia Sterling asked me to audit your books." I continued delivering each sentence with surgical precision. "She wanted her lead external strategist to review your firm before she committed a single dime to your expansion proposal. She handed me your financial disclosures, Brad." I opened the files. My mother, Brenda, let out a sharp gasp, stepping away from the doorway. Uncle Robert stood up from his chair, the leather creaking loudly in the quiet room. "I saw the shadow accounts," I said, holding his gaze. "I saw the mezzanine debt you took on to cover your operational losses. I saw the 3 home equity lines of credit maxed out on your primary residence. I saw the 25% interest rates on your credit cards. I saw the shell game you have been playing for 2 years to convince this entire neighborhood that you are a king." "Stop!" Chloe sobbed from the corner of the room. "Please stop!" I did not stop. I maintained my focus on Brad. I wrote the audit report I told him. I detailed every single liability hiding behind your polished pitch deck. I told Sylvia Sterling your firm was a toxic asset with 0 potential for recovery. I advised her to deny your funding request and sever all communications. Brad swayed slightly on his feet. The crystal glass in his hand tipped, spilling a few drops of amber liquid onto the Persian rug. "I killed your $10 million lifeline, Brad. I killed it with a single keystroke because the math proved you are bankrupt." The silence that followed was total. It was a suffocating vacuum that swallowed the holiday music and the crackling fire. The carefully constructed illusion of the Smith family hierarchy shattered into microscopic pieces on the hardwood floor. Brad dropped his glass. It hit the rug with a dull thud, bourbon soaking into the expensive wool fibers. He did not look at the spill. He did not look at his wife. He stared at me with the hollow, vacant expression of a man who has just watched his executioner drop the blade. The aunts and uncles who had spent years admiring his tailored suits and his boastful stories now looked at him with revulsion. The smell of financial ruin is distinct and unforgiving in circles that value status above all else. They realized instantly that the golden couple of Mountain Brook was a mirage. They realized every boast, every condescending remark, every act of false charity was funded by desperate, crippling debt. I lowered the prospectus and slid it back into my handbag. I had delivered the truth. I had dismantled the lie that allowed them to treat me and my children like disposable peasants. The confrontation was over. I had won the war without ever raising my voice. But the fallout from this revelation was about to rip through the room, and I needed to remove my children before the shrapnel hit. I turned away from Brad, ready to execute my departure and sever the final tether to this toxic foundation. Brad did not move. He stood in the center of the living room, while the amber liquid from his dropped glass soaked deeply into the expensive wool fibers of my mother's Persian rug. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a ledge and was waiting for the ground to rush up and meet him. The posture he spent years cultivating, the thrown-back shoulders and the thrust-out chest, simply collapsed inward. He became a hollow shell, wearing a pastel linen suit that suddenly looked absurd. He had no counter-argument. He had no alternative narrative to spin. The truth was a physical weight pressing him down into the floorboards. Chloe broke the silence. She let out a sound that was half gasp and half sob. It was an ugly, guttural noise that shattered the polite holiday atmosphere. She did not rush to comfort her husband. She did not wrap her arms around him to offer support in his darkest moment. Instead, she sank slowly to her knees right next to the miniature silver Mercedes I had purchased for my son. She covered her face with her manicured hands and began to weep. Her tears were not for Brad. They were for herself. She wept for the impending foreclosures, the repossessed vehicles, and the loss of her pristine social standing. She wept because the charity she offered my children was exposed as a desperate attempt to hide her own ruin. The aunts and uncles shifted uncomfortably, turning their faces away from the weeping woman on the floor. The admiration they previously held for the golden couple evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, clinical distance. In Mountain Brook, financial failure is a contagious disease, and nobody wanted to stand too close to the infected. Uncle Robert checked his watch, pretending he had somewhere else to be. Cousin David stared at the ceiling, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The room that had been a stage for their superiority was now a tomb for their reputation. I stood tall in my charcoal cashmere coat, holding my designer handbag. I looked at the devastation I had wrought, and I expected to feel a surge of vindictive triumph. I expected the revenge to taste sweet. But it did not. It tasted like nothing. It was just a cold, hard fact. I looked at Brad staring blankly at the wall and Chloe sobbing into her hands, and I realized I had nothing left to prove. The decade of shrinking myself to fit their narrative was over. The game was finished, and I had taken the board with me. I turned my attention away from the wreckage. I looked down at Leo and Mia. They were holding their thick, cream-colored envelopes, watching the adults with wide, solemn eyes. They were too young to understand the complex financial mechanics of what had just occurred, but they understood the emotional shift. They knew their mother was the strongest person in the room. They felt the safety radiating from my calm demeanor. "It is time to go," I said, my voice gentle, directed only at my children. "Leo," Brenda finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. The reality of the situation crashed over her. Her perfect Christmas Eve party was destroyed. Her neighbors were likely peering through the bay window watching her golden daughter sobbing on the rug. Her son-in-law was exposed as a fraud, and Brenda rushed forward, her red cocktail dress swishing around her legs. She intercepted me at the archway leading into the hall. She reached out and grabbed my forearm, her fingers digging into the soft cashmere of my coat. Her grip was tight, fueled by sheer social panic. "Adela, you cannot leave," she hissed, her voice a desperate, vibrating whisper. "You cannot drop a bomb like this in the middle of my living room and just walk away. Look at your sister. Look at what you have done. You need to stay here. You need to help us figure this out and act like family." I stopped walking. I looked down at her hand clutching my arm. Then I looked into her eyes. The same eyes that had watched coldly while Chloe told my son Santa ignored poor people. The same eyes that had flashed with malice when she threatened to call Child Protective Services on me just months ago. I reached over with my free hand and gently but firmly detached her fingers from my coat. I lowered her arm back to her side, stripping away her physical control, just as I had stripped away her psychological control. Family does not starve someone to make themselves feel full, Mom, I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried an undeniable finality. You chose your side a long time ago. Now you have to live with the investment you made. Brenda opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat. She had no leverage left. She could not threaten me. She could not intimidate me. She was just an aging woman standing in a foyer, watching her carefully curated world disintegrate. She lowered her gaze, unable to maintain eye contact with the woman I had become. I guided Leo and Mia to the front door. We did not look back. I opened the heavy oak door, and we stepped out into the crisp December night. The cold air hit my face, feeling incredibly clean and sharp. The door clicked shut behind us, sealing the chaos and the weeping inside the house. We walked down the brick path toward the matte black Range Rover. The neighbors were still lingering on their lawns, trying to look casual while stealing glances at my vehicle. I ignored them. They were part of a world I no longer needed to navigate. They were extras in a play I had just walked out of. I opened the passenger doors and helped my children climb into the plush leather seats. They buckled their seatbelts, holding their envelopes tightly in their laps. I walked around to the driver's side and climbed in. The heavy door sealed shut, blocking out the ambient noise of the neighborhood. The isolation of the cabin felt like a sanctuary. I pushed the ignition button. The powerful engine roared to life, sending a subtle vibration through the steering wheel. The climate control system immediately began wrapping us in warm air, chasing away the chill of the evening. I shifted the vehicle into drive and pulled smoothly out of the circular driveway. I did not look at the living room window. I did not check the rearview mirror to see if Brenda had followed us onto the porch. My focus was entirely forward. We drove away from Mountain Brook, leaving the sprawling brick estates and the twinkling white lights behind us. The cabin of the SUV was silent except for the soft hum of the tires on the asphalt. It was a warm, safe silence. I felt a physical sensation in my chest. A heavy, suffocating weight that I had carried for a decade simply evaporated into the heated air. The shame, the anxiety, the constant need to justify my existence, it was all gone. I was driving my own vehicle, paid for with my own money, taking my children back to a secure home that I owned. The fortress was complete, and the gates were locked. Leo leaned his head against the tinted window, watching the city lights blur past. "Mom?" he asked, his voice quiet and filled with wonder. "Are we really going to learn how to ski?" "Yes, baby," I smiled, keeping my eyes on the dark road ahead. "We are going to learn how to ski." Mia kicked her feet happily against the floor mat, holding her envelope against her chest. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the tension drain from my shoulders. The peace was profound. The victory was absolute. But even as we drove toward our new life, I knew the story was not entirely finished for the people we left behind. The destruction of Brad's firm would send shockwaves through their entire social circle. The impending bank foreclosures, the repossessed cars, the public humiliation. It was all waiting for them on the other side of the holidays. And when the dust finally settled, when the golden facade was entirely stripped away, leaving nothing but cold, hard reality, I knew Chloe would have to face the one person she had spent her entire life running from. Herself. The first week of January arrived in Birmingham, bringing gray skies and bitter cold, but my world had never felt warmer. The trip to Switzerland was everything I had promised my children. We skied down pristine alpine slopes, drank thick hot chocolate in a wooden chalet, and watched fireworks explode over the Matterhorn on New Year's Eve. It was a tangible, undeniable celebration of survival. We returned to Alabama refreshed and secure, leaving the wreckage of my family entirely behind us. The fallout from Christmas Eve did not stay confined to the walls of my mother's living room. In a community like Mountain Brook, secrets are currency, and the revelation of Brad's impending bankruptcy was the most valuable gossip of the decade. The aunts and uncles who witnessed the confrontation wasted no time spreading the news. The story circulated through the country club locker rooms, the local boutique fitness classes, and the exclusive charity board meetings. Brad's firm, Mountain Brook Capital Partners, collapsed in mid-February. The few legitimate clients he had left caught wind of his financial instability and pulled their assets simultaneously. It was a classic run on the bank, and Brad had zero liquidity to survive it. The creditors who had been hovering like vultures finally descended. The sleek downtown office was locked, the staff was laid off without severance, and the corporate assets were liquidated for pennies on the dollar. The personal ruin followed shortly after. Brad and Chloe had financed their entire lifestyle through highly leveraged debt, and the house of cards finally tipped over. They were forced to sell the sprawling brick estate in Mountain Brook to avoid active foreclosure proceedings. The custom furniture, the designer wardrobes, the leased luxury vehicles, it all vanished within 90 days. They moved into a cramped, modest rental property in a neighboring suburb, effectively exiled from the social circles they had dominated for years. My mother, Brenda, suffered a different kind of ruin. Her identity was entirely dependent on her social standing and her proximity to perceived success. When the neighborhood learned that her golden son-in-law was a fraud, her pristine reputation shattered. The women she played tennis with stopped returning her calls. The charity boards she served on quietly suggested she step down to avoid associating their organizations with the scandal. She was left alone in her large, quiet house, stripped of the audience she desperately needed to feel important. I observed the destruction from a comfortable distance. I did not gloat. I did not monitor their public downfall with vindictive joy. I simply went to work. My agency was flourishing. The Vanguard Athletic Group contract had expanded into a multi-year retainer, and Sylvia Sterling referred 2 more high-net-worth clients to my firm. I hired a managing director to handle the day-to-day operations, allowing me to step back and focus entirely on high-level strategy. I spent my afternoons picking Leo and Mia up from school, helping them with homework at our quartz kitchen island, and taking them to soccer practice. I built a life that was rich not just in capital, but in time and peace. 6 months passed. The blistering heat of an Alabama summer settled over the city. I was sitting in my sunlit home office drinking iced coffee and reviewing the quarterly projections for a new client. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background. The mail carrier had just dropped off a stack of envelopes. I sorted through the pile, discarding the junk mail and setting the business correspondence aside. At the bottom of the stack was a thick ivory envelope. There was no return address. The front simply read, Adela, written in a familiar, elegant script. It was Chloe. I held the envelope in my hand. I felt a brief flicker of the old anxiety, the conditioned response to my sister's presence. But the feeling vanished almost instantly, replaced by a calm, detached curiosity. I reached for my silver letter opener and sliced through the paper. Inside was a single, handwritten letter covering 3 pages of expensive stationery. The handwriting was neat, but slightly shaky, as if the author had struggled to maintain control of the pen. I unfolded the letter and began to read. Adela, I am writing this because I do not have the courage to call you, and I know you would not answer the phone if I tried. I am not writing to ask for money. We have lost everything, and the bankruptcy proceedings are finalizing next month. Brad is working as a junior analyst at a commercial bank, and I have taken a job as a receptionist at a dental office. The humiliation is complete, and I know I deserve every single ounce of it. I paused, taking a sip of my iced coffee. The image of Chloe answering phones in a dental office was a stark contrast to the woman who used to hand me garbage bags of stained clothes. I continued reading. I am writing to apologize. I know the word sounds hollow after years of cruelty. I know an apology does not fix the damage I caused you or Leo and Mia. But I need you to know the truth. For years, I watched you struggle. I watched you raise 2 children alone while working a terrible job and living in a tiny apartment. I should have admired your strength. Instead, I used it to make myself feel safe. Brad's firm was failing long before you audited his books. We were drowning in debt, and the panic was constant. Every time I looked at my credit card statements, I felt like I could not breathe. So I looked at you. I looked at your old car and your cheap clothes, and I told myself that at least I was not you. I used your poverty as a shield against my own terror. When I told Leo that Santa ignores poor people, it was the ugliest, most vile thing I have ever said. I did it because I was terrified that our own kids were about to lose everything, and I needed to feel superior one last time. I projected my own massive insecurities onto you. You were building a real life, and I was maintaining a fake one. You do not have to forgive me, Adela. I just needed you to know that you were always the strong one. I am so sorry. Chloe. I set the letter down on the polished mahogany desk. The silence in my office was profound. I read the words again, letting the admission of guilt sink in. The golden child, the sister who had tormented me for a decade, was finally holding the mirror up to her own face. The apology was genuine. It was broken, stripped of the usual arrogance and defensive posturing. She was not trying to negotiate. She was simply stating the facts of her own failure. I felt a profound sense of closure. The phantom weight of her judgment, the lingering sting of her condescension, it evaporated entirely. The letter was the final piece of the puzzle. The realization that their cruelty was born from terror rather than superiority was incredibly liberating. I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a single sheet of heavy stock paper. I uncapped my fountain pen. If you are listening to this story right now, I want you to think about what you would do. If the family member who tore you down for years suddenly handed you a genuine, broken apology, would you let them back into your life? Would you open the door? I began to write my response. Chloe, I received your letter. I appreciate your honesty, and I understand the terror that drove your actions. I forgive you. I am letting go of the anger because carrying it does not serve me anymore. However, forgiveness is not the same thing as access. We are both walking different paths now. I wish you and Brad the best as you rebuild your lives, but this will be my final communication. Please do not contact me or my children again. Adela. I folded the note, slid it into a blank envelope and sealed it. I did not include a return address. I walked out to the mailbox at the end of my driveway and dropped it inside, raising the red flag. I walked back into my secure townhome, locking the heavy front door behind me. I had closed the book. The chapter of my life defined by my toxic family was permanently finished. The fortress was impenetrable. But a fortress is only a building. It requires a life inside it to make it a home. I had secured the capital, I had neutralized the threat, and I had protected my children. Now it was time to enjoy the peace I had fought so desperately to earn. The holiday season was approaching once again, and this time, Santa was going to visit our house strictly on my terms. It has been exactly 2 years since I drove away from my mother's house in Mountain Brook, leaving behind a decade of humiliation on her pristine Persian rug. Tonight, the air in my home smells like roasted chestnuts and expensive vanilla. The vaulted ceiling of my living room is illuminated by the soft glow of a massive 10-foot Fraser fir. But this tree is not decorated to impress the neighbors or to serve as a backdrop for a calculated charity performance. It is decorated with mismatched ornaments my children made in school, alongside vintage glass baubles I purchased simply because I thought they were beautiful. I am hosting a holiday party, but the guest list looks entirely different from the ones Brenda used to curate. The people filling my home tonight are not bound to me by blood or obligation. They are bound by mutual respect. They are the chosen family I built, brick by brick, during the quiet, grueling years when I was assembling my fortress. Sylvia Sterling is standing near the marble kitchen island, holding a glass of vintage champagne. She is wearing a sharp silver pantsuit, looking every bit the corporate titan she is. She is currently deep in conversation with my lead operations director, a brilliant woman I hired away from a massive tech firm in Atlanta. They are discussing the global supply chain crisis, and Sylvia is laughing. It is the genuine, terrifying bark of laughter I first heard in her Huntsville office. My accountant David is here with his husband. The real estate broker who found me this house is sitting on the sofa showing pictures of her new rescue dog to Mia. These are the people who watched me scale an empire. They know exactly what it took to get here, and they celebrate it without a single ounce of jealousy. I stand near the fireplace watching the scene unfold. The warmth in the room is not just ambient temperature. It is a palpable, secure energy. Leo and Mia are sitting on the floor near the tree, opening their presents. Leo is 10 now, and Mia is 8. They are thriving. They do not shrink when adults speak to them. They do not hesitate to ask for what they want, because they know their requests will be met with consideration, not resentment. Leo tears the wrapping paper off a large rectangular box. It is a high-end robotics kit. He has shown a massive interest in engineering lately, and I made sure he has the best tools available to explore it. He lets out a loud cheer, holding the box up for Mia to see. Mia is unwrapping a professional-grade easel and a set of oil paints. She is becoming incredibly artistic, and her work already hangs framed in my home office. There are no cheap charity toys. There are no passive-aggressive comments about the cost. There is only abundance. I walk over to the kitchen island and pick up my own glass of sparkling water. Sylvia catches my eye and raises her champagne flute in a silent toast. I smile and return the gesture. I think about the letter sitting in the locked drawer of my desk. The broken apology from Chloe. I have not spoken to her or my parents since the day I mailed my response. The boundary I set remains absolute. Sometimes people ask me if I miss them. They assume that estrangement must leave a permanent gaping hole in your life. They think blood is the only valid currency for human connection. But the truth is, I do not miss them at all. When you spend your entire life twisting yourself into painful knots to avoid triggering the insecurities of the people who are supposed to love you, their absence does not feel like a void. It feels like taking off a heavy, wet coat you have been wearing for 28 years. The space they used to occupy in my mind is now filled with strategy, ambition, and peace. The silence they used to weaponize against me is now the exact sound of my freedom. I look at the beautiful custom millwork framing my living room windows. I look at the chef-grade appliances in my kitchen and the plush imported rugs on the floors. I look at the life I built for my children out of pure desperation and an old, cracked laptop. For a long time, I thought my motivation was revenge. I thought the ultimate victory was standing in that Mountain Brook living room and watching Brad's ego collapse under the weight of his own toxic debt. I thought the payoff was the look of sheer terror on my mother's face when she realized her scapegoat held all the capital. But standing here tonight, listening to the sound of my children laughing with my mentor, I realize that revenge is just the first step. It is the explosive force you need to break orbit. True vindication is what happens after. True vindication is not about destroying your enemies. It is about outgrowing them so completely that their opinions, their judgments, and their entire existence no longer register in your reality. They become irrelevant. They become tiny fading dots in the rearview mirror of a custom vehicle driving toward a horizon they can never reach. Brad and Chloe are living the consequences of their own arrogance. Brenda is living the reality of her own shallow cruelty. They built a world based on diminishing others, and they are now trapped inside it. I built a fortress based on competence, leverage, and undeniable truth. And the doors to my fortress are locked. I set my glass down on the marble counter. I walk over to the Christmas tree and kneel down beside Leo and Mia. The warmth of the fire radiates against my back. "Mom, look at this," Leo says, pointing to a complex schematic on the back of the robotics box. "It has an integrated motor. I can program it with the laptop." "It looks incredible, Leo," I tell him, brushing a piece of wrapping paper off his shoulder. "I cannot wait to see what you build with it." Mia holds up a tube of bright cobalt blue paint. "I am going to paint the mountains we saw in Switzerland," she declares, her eyes shining with absolute certainty. "I know you will, Mia." I smile. "It is going to be beautiful." I wrap an arm around each of them, pulling them close. They lean into me, smelling of peppermint and the sweet cedar of the Christmas tree. They are safe. They will never have to listen to an aunt tell them they are unworthy. They will never have to watch their mother shrink to make someone else feel tall. If you have listened to this story from the very beginning, I want you to remember one thing. Your worth is not determined by the people who try to make you feel small. It is not dictated by the family you were born into or the financial struggles you face today. Your worth is the quiet, relentless engine inside you that refuses to quit. It is the ability to look at a wobbly kitchen table and see the foundation of an empire. Do not wait for the toxic people in your life to see your value. They will never see it because acknowledging your light requires them to admit they are living in the dark. Build the fortress, set the boundaries. Do the work in the shadows until your success is so blinding they have no choice but to cover their eyes. And when you finally reach the top, do not look back down at them. Look forward. Look at the beautiful, peaceful life you built with your own 2 hands. My name is Adela Smith. I am a CEO, a mother, and the architect of my own reality. And tonight, in the home I built from nothing, Santa is visiting my children exactly on my terms. Thank you for listening. There are moments in parenting that define the trajectory of a child's life, not because of what was explicitly taught, but because of what was quietly permitted. If you had asked my mother, Brenda, what she valued most, she would likely have said family. It is a word we wrap around ourselves like a protective blanket, especially in the quiet, manicured neighborhoods of America, where tradition and appearance often intertwine so tightly they become indistinguishable. But what happens when the very institution meant to protect you becomes the source of your deepest humiliation? The year my children, Leo and Mia, learned the true cost of our family's values was the year I finally understood my role as a mother. I was 28, scraping by in a cramped apartment after my husband abandoned us, while my sister Chloe and her husband Brad lived a life of least luxury in Mountain Brook. They were the golden standard. I was the cautionary tale. I remember the Christmas Eve sitting in my mother's immaculate living room. The air smelled of roasted pine and expensive privilege. Chloe, flushed with the kind of confidence that only comes from deep insecurity, looked at my 7-year-old son Leo and delivered a sentence that still rings in my ears. Santa doesn't really visit poor people's houses. It wasn't just the cruelty of the statement that shocked me. It was the silence that followed. My mother, the matriarch, simply sipped her wine. In that silence, a profound lesson about American family dynamics was crystallized. We often confuse loyalty to the family unit with complicity in its toxicity. As parents, we are tasked with being the ultimate guardians of our children's sense of worth. When Brenda allowed financial status to be equated with Leo's moral value, she failed that fundamental duty. Protecting your children doesn't just mean keeping them physically safe. It means fiercely guarding their emotional landscape from those who would use their vulnerability as a weapon, even if those people share your last name. That night, as I drove my crying children back to our small apartment, the grief was replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I realized that my family's version of traditional values was a facade built on social standing and country club memberships. They used my struggle not as an opportunity for support, but as a baseline of failure to make their own achievements look taller. This is the silent crisis in many modern American families. The prioritization of appearances over genuine emotional integrity. Brad and Chloe raised their children in an environment of elitism, teaching them that value is derived from what you can display. But as I would later discover, their entire empire was built on toxic, highly leveraged debt. They were drowning, yet they clung to the illusion of superiority because they had never been taught the difference between looking successful and actually being secure. My journey out of that apartment wasn't born from a desire for revenge, but from an absolute necessity to redefine what family education meant for Leo and Mia. I embraced what I call the silent grind. While my family mocked me, I spent the hours between 9 p.m. and 3:00 a.m. building a boutique digital strategy agency. I learned that true stability isn't found in the superficial validation of others. It is forged in the dark, through discipline and undeniable skill. For the young people navigating their own paths, the lesson is stark. Do not let the small-minded expectations of those around you dictate your potential. I was dismissed as an underpaid administrative assistant, but through sheer perseverance, I built an enterprise that eventually held the power to audit and dismantle Brad's failing firm. I discovered the profound difference between the loud fragility of fake wealth and the silent leverage of actual value. When the time came for the reckoning, exactly 1 year later, I didn't just want to hand my children expensive toys to spite my sister. I wanted to hand them a foundation. As Chloe attempted to reassert her dominance by giving Leo and Mia cheap charity gifts, I stepped in. The miniature motorized cars I provided were tangible magic, yes, but the real gifts were the fully funded college trust portfolios. I needed to show my children that security isn't a handout. It is the result of hard work, integrity, and the refusal to be defined by someone else's limitations. Perhaps the most complex aspect of family responsibility is the concept of forgiveness. In traditional structures, we are often pressured to reconcile at all costs, to keep the peace. But true emotional awareness requires a more nuanced approach. When Chloe's world collapsed and she sent me a broken, genuine apology, I forgave her. I released the anger because carrying it no longer served me. However, I did not invite her back into my life. Forgiveness does not equal access. Setting that boundary was the final lesson I needed to teach my children. You can have compassion for someone's brokenness without allowing them to break you. Sometimes, maintaining a healthy, chosen family is more honorable and traditional than remaining tethered to a biological one that refuses to grow. If this story resonates with the silent battles you are fighting, or if you are navigating the complex terrain of protecting your own peace within a difficult family, please join our community. Subscribe and follow the channel Sophia Revenge Stories for more narratives about resilience, boundaries, and the quiet power of rebuilding your life on your own terms. We all carry the echoes of the living rooms we grew up in. The question is whether we allow those echoes to dictate our future, or if we use them to build walls thick enough to keep the noise out. When you finally stop trying to earn a seat at a table that was never meant for you, you realize you have the power to build your own. And in the quiet of that realization, as you look around at the life you constructed from the wreckage, you might find yourself wondering, who is actually writing the story of your family's legacy?